If you've been playing guitar for any amount of time, I guarantee that at some point you have asked yourself, how much money do I need to spend on my rig? That's a great question. There's a lot of parts to it, and I'd love to talk about it. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Welcome to Blazing Guitars. So if you've been around YouTube for any amount of time and have seen guitar channels, at some point you will have come across a budget guitar challenge. And I think the reason a lot of channels do this is because people really want to know, how can I get the most gear with the least amount of money? And so the idea is they'll take $500 and see what they can come up with $500. And I think that's a really important thing to engage with, especially as worship leaders. You know, I think the question is, what's reasonable to spend? Is it reasonable to spend $2,500 on a guitar, or should you spend that money someplace else? Should you like save for your kids' college or something? So there's this tension that a lot of musicians have, especially I think guitarists, of, man, what's reasonable to spend here and what do I need to spend? And there's also an element of where your congregation or your audience might not hear a difference between like a rig that costs thousands of dollars and a rig that costs $1,000. You know, so there's all kinds of questions and elements to this that I think are important to address and explore as you're thinking about buying your first guitar or buying your first rig. So just before we get into it any further, I'd just like to say I've definitely been on all sides of the spectrum. I haven't gotten to like the super expensive stuff yet, but just I remember borrowing my first guitars to play at church, and I remember going to a pawn shop and picking up the Zoom G9.2 TT for $300 at the pawn shop and just being like, this is it. I don't have to buy anything else the rest of my life. And just going through those experiences and trying to figure out, you know, how do I spend money, and is digital okay, or do I have to spend for analog stuff, or what does that look like? So just to say that a lot of this is a journey, and a lot of this is dependent on preference. So keep that in mind just as we kind of go through this. So the first thing that I think is important to address in this is, if you can't afford to buy like really expensive gear, then don't buy really expensive gear. So, you know, it's easy in American culture and in our culture just to throw money at something, even if you can't afford it, and to put it on a credit card and do payment plans and all this stuff. But just the reality is if you cannot afford it, then don't buy it. There's all kinds of different ways to get a sound, and there's all kinds of different ways to get an experience. You do not have to drop a ton of money to get good guitar tone. That's just where we're at in life. And it's kind of crazy. And I think a lot of tone purists would probably argue with me on that. But the reality is, you know, if, again, going back to the audience thing, if you're playing in front of people, many of them will not be able to tell the difference between a $3,000 rig and a $1,000 rig. Now, there's a caveat in that where I think more expensive gear gives you a different feeling. And I think for a lot of people, that feeling can make a huge difference in their playing. So there's the balance of what's reasonable to spend, and then there's also the balance of what inspires me to play well. So that's just stuff that has to be weighed out. You know, you have to think through that stuff. So as you're going through this, I would really encourage you to ask, can you actually afford it, and what can you afford? And put yourself on a budget. That's one thing that I've done in the last couple of years. I just have a monthly guitar budget, and the only way to speed that up is if I have to sell off gear. So just put yourself on a budget and just see it as a journey, as something that's not static, as something that will change. And I think that'll help kind of take some of the pressure off. You know, I think for a long time I had this idea of like, I need to come up with the rig. And the reality is, you know, I used like an 11 rack for a couple years, and the 11 rack was great, and that was perfect for where I was at. But then I started getting into other stuff, and that's just life, and that's just music, and it changes, and your styles and tastes will change, and you'll see something cool that you might want to get. So just be flexible with it, and I think see it as a journey and not something that's like really static that you have to come up with. The other thing is just realizing where to look and like what companies to look for. So, you know, you can get Klon. Let's take the Klon for example. So the Klon, if you don't know what a Klon is, go look it up. Klon centaurs were made back in the 90s, and due to some crazy nonsense, they are now selling for like $5,000, but originally they were selling for $285, and so it's kind of this whole crazy story. And there's a lot of companies and pedal makers that make Klon clones, and a lot of those range from like $200 to $300. But this guy, the Electro-Harmonic Soul Food, is $80 brand new, and it sounds amazing. So, you know, do your research and find out, you know, does this work, and try it and pick it up and sell it. One other super nice thing about musical instruments, just kind of in general, especially the analog stuff. I think the digital stuff is a little bit different, but for the most part, this stuff will hold its value and might even gain value depending on what you get. But I wouldn't expect it to gain value, but I would, you know, not plan on losing. If I turn around and tried to sell this, I'd get pretty close to what I paid for it. But you know, anything with Boss has been around forever, and they just make good solid stuff, and all their pedals are like under $100. So just kind of know where to look. The other big question and a big determining factor in this is, should you go digital or analog? And I'm going to do a separate video on this topic just to discuss it and explore it a little bit different. But I think it kind of depends on what you're looking for. Digital, and this, everything I'm about to say was not true 10 years ago. So digital now is almost indiscernible from analog. And I know, again, it comes back to that feeling thing, right? So if you stick a guy that's been playing in front of a loud amp for 20 years and you stick him in front of a silent digital rig, he's going to play different, and he's probably going to say it sounds worse because he doesn't have the feeling. But if you take like objective looks, especially as a listener and not as the player, then digital and analog are almost indiscernible these days. And I'm going to get a lot of flack for that if the right people see this video. So I stand by it. I think digital is an extremely viable option. So if you want to do digital, you can find things at like pretty reasonable prices. So I'll give you an example. Probably 10 years ago, there was a product called the 11 rack. And the 11 rack was like the cutting edge of digital technology. And it was kind of right before Kemper kind of came in and introduced the modeling idea. And so the 11 rack was kind of like the cutting edge, and every studio would have like 11 racks in there. And I picked an 11 rack up a couple years ago for like $200 or $250. And the crazy thing is people's ears haven't changed that much in 10 years. And if you ask somebody about the 11 rack, they're gonna look at you like you're crazy because it's such old technology. But the reality is that it still sounds pretty stinking good. And if you want to plug it in and play with it, that's a really viable rig option. And it's your whole rig for $200, which is crazy. So especially if you're talking about the digital world, there's things to look at, like, you know, can you find a good old multi-effects processor for like $200 and then get a cheap guitar? Like Squire's making some amazing stuff. Epiphone's making some good stuff. I have an Epiphone Les Paul back there. There's just kind of cheaper gear than there ever has been, and it's good, high quality stuff. So depending on what your needs are, and if you're looking for an acoustic, I would definitely spring for $300. But if you're looking for like an electric, you could easily get a $250 electric and an old 11 rack and have a rig that's really viable and has a lot of good stuff in it for $500. And that's crazy. This is like the first time in history you've been able to really come up with something like that in that type of way. So think about that if you're looking at the digital aspect. If you're looking to go for more the analog route, what I would suggest is maybe getting 2 overdrive pedals if I had to redo it. So getting something like the Soul Food and the Blues Driver, or like a Tube Screamer. Just get a couple of overdrive pedals and then maybe like a delay. Even talking about older technology, this is the first standalone pedal that I got a couple years ago, and these sell for like $150, and you have 4 presets and it sounds great still, and it's got a tap. So something like this. My first reverb was an Electro Harmonics Hall of Fame. You could get the Holy Grail for super cheap money. So you know, plan on what you're going to get and then save up for it. The idea being, you know, maybe get 2 overdrives or 1 overdrive and then a delay and a reverb, and then maybe just get something fun like a modulation pedal, like this Moore tremolo, or this is the E-Lady from Moore, which is a flanger. So just get something kind of fun to add some texture. And then there's a ton of cheap tube amps is what I would look at. So look at getting like a cheap tube amp like Fender Blues Junior, or I have a Vox AC15, which is pretty cheap if you can find it used. And with a tube amp and with pedals, you're looking at more like the $1,000 range. You can definitely find cheaper stuff than that, and you don't need all the suggestions that I just gave you, but that's just kind of how I'd start thinking about it. You know, what do you need for a power supply? What do you need for a board? Boards you can just make. You can just find old pieces of wood and stick Velcro on it and you're good to go. And there's hundreds of videos out there to look at like building out a cheap pedal board. That's where I would start. Those are kind of the places I would start. So if you're looking at analog, I would expect to pay $750 or $1,000 for the whole thing. If you're looking at digital, you could probably get away with $500, and maybe that's the answer to the question. You know, if you're starting at nothing, then maybe digital is the way to go. But if you're like way more physical, so one of the reasons I'm not digital anymore is because I'm just a very tangible like person. I like feeling the knobs and the buttons and seeing where everything's at on one go and not going through menus. So that's just something that you have to decide, and there's no right answer to that. People will tell you that there's a right answer to that, but I guarantee that there's no right answer to that. So you know, if you are looking at like a Helix, like the Pod, I think those sell for $300 or something. Just know that, you know, you're gonna have to it's gonna take some time to fiddle with it and get used to it. So another really important element in all this to understand is diminishing returns. So there's this idea that if you spend $200 on a guitar versus like $400 on a guitar, the $400 guitar might be close to about 2 times as good as the $200 guitar. But if you're looking at like a $1,500 guitar and a $3,000 guitar, the $1,500 guitar will not be half as bad as the $3,000 guitar. That as you go up, the quality kind of starts diminishing and you start not getting as much bang for your buck. So if you're looking for like a good middle of the road to high end, I would say $800 to $1,200, or you know, $2,000 is probably the most I personally would spend on a guitar, but that's just me, and that's also probably because I haven't touched many $2,000 guitars, so I'm very easily changed and could be changed. But if you're looking for like cheap guitars, you know, Squier or Epiphone, they all put out great stuff kind of in those you know, Tele, Jaguars, Strats, Les Pauls, 335s, like in those range, you could really get some good stuff right in that $500, $300 range that are really solid. And then the final thing I would say, and I'm actually not going to show you a guitar pedal here, but this is a TC Helicon that I got. I did a review on this, and this was $150 or $200 when I got it, and I felt like this really increased my playing, like the minimal baseline of my playing. I feel like this just added so much and just kind of boosted me to the next level. So what I would encourage as you're thinking about gear and as you're thinking about like, what am I going to get next? Think about things that can help you play better and help you perform better. And there are things that can really lead you down rabbit trails and will not do that. And then there's things that, like this for me, that can just maybe be a total switch or total change for you. So just keep that in mind as you're thinking through things. That's what I got for you guys. I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions or have any thoughts or suggestions that you would have for like cheap gear, let me know in the comments below. And if you'd like advice on this, you are also welcome to leave a comment, or you can jump into my Discord and I'd be happy to talk about cheap gear and where to find it and how to get started. So thank you guys so much for watching, and we will see you next week.